On today's show, the DfT publishes, finally, the Rail Reform Bill. But is there much point to it? We report on the annual Bradshaw lecture, which saw two senior rail politicians go head-to-head. But who came out on top? More to the point, did we hear anything new? Avanti West Coast is in the national news yet again, thanks largely to ASLEF. But has the union actually overstepped the mark a bit this time? And Richard has been in the firing line, again, over his comments on plans to reverse Beeching's closures. But being Richard, of course, he's fighting back. Hello, and welcome to Green Signals from me, Nigel Harris, and
me, Richard Bowker, and I have to apologise today, Nigel. I'm full of a cold, so if I look a bit washed out and I blow my nose, you know why.
We sympathise, Richard. You do sound a bit snotty, if one might put it like that. Yeah. Get the Lemsip, which I would recommend you put a slug of honey, some brown sugar, and maybe a slug of whiskey in. It makes you feel better.
Ooh, I like the sound of that.
Indeed so. So, if you enjoy the show as ever, give the episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. And wherever you're watching or listening, please subscribe. It's completely free and it helps us to grow Green Signals and do more of what we figure you enjoy. So, there was quite the reaction to your comments on Borders Railway and Beeching last week, Richard.
Certainly was, wasn't there? I mean, it's so much so that we thought we'd chat a bit more about it today. So, if you want a bit more beaching and a bit more, Bowker bashing, then hold fire. It's coming.
Have your pens at the ready. One thing we mentioned last week that we had flexed the publishing schedule for the pod a bit. However, having tried it, we actually rather like publishing the weekly magazine show. That's this one. On Thursday, because it allows us to do something else earlier in the week, a bit more time, whether it's in a big interview or a video out and about on the railway, whatever we felt like. So we'll probably keep it on Thursdays. If you subscribe, of course, you get a notification anyway, so you never need miss an episode. Another interesting week in the news. It's rarely anything other for the railway, is it, Richard?
Nope.
But the biggest recent news on Tuesday, February the 20th, was publication of the DfT's Rail Reform Bill.
What was that? You had a go at me last week for sort of doing a sound effect of jointed track, and now you've just done that.
It was a little fanfare, Richard.
Is that what it was? I'm so pleased. And he did it again.
I thought it was.
Anyway.
Right. Not wishing to make light of the DfT's Rail Reform Bill, but on the face of it, it was pretty much the rather thin gruel of what we expected from the Williams review. A single guiding mind, the bringing together of a system approach, franchising authority moving to GBR. There's only 32 pages, and was it 19 clauses? Was there much else that caught your experienced Whitehall eye, Richard?
Well, there was actually. Okay. There was one thing which I thought was an interesting question of tone, and I think it'd be interesting to see what we both think about this. I mean, before I mention what that is, you do actually kind of ask yourself the question, what really is the point of this? Is this just a bit of kind of grandstanding? It's going to go forward for pre-legislative scrutiny. That's actually fine, but it's not going to get into the actual legislative program before the next election. So is it actually ever going to happen in this form? I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it, as to what a new government, assuming that isn't this one, would do with it.
As you say, on only 32 pages, it's a bit half-hearted. After all, Harper's big promises at last year's Bradshaw lecture, which came to absolutely nothing, I think there's an argument that they just decided they thought they needed to be seen to be doing something.
Well, possibly, but it doesn't have to be long in length to be big in impact in terms of change. And there are some things in it that are absolutely consistent with the Williams review that we've all been shouting for, really. I
Correct.
mean,
the big one.
Yeah. Well, the one of the biggest ones for me is just getting the franchising control away from
That's
civil
the big
servants,
one,
right?
yes,
So,
yeah.
and it does that, or it says it's going to do that. And I saw some slightly unfair comments saying, "Oh yes, but are they really going to be removed because the Secretary of State can still make directions?" Well, he can still make directions to the Strategic Rail Authority, right? So I don't think
clause, isn't it?
it's a standard thing. So I didn't really see that. No, the interesting point for me with this one of tone was the comments about the private sector. Now,
yes.
I've got to say, I mean, anybody listening knows, I hope, that, I'm very much a sort of a creature of the private sector, right? So I haven't suddenly just sort of banged my head and changed something. But I was surprised when I opened the bill and started to read it. The first clause talks about them having to have a business plan, which is fine. You'd expect that. The second one is an annual report setting out what this new integrated rail body. I mean, it's a bit confusing in language. When we say integrated rail body, we effectively, I believe, think we're talking about GBR, right? As it will become. But what has the integrated rail body done to really promote the development of the private sector in the railway? And it's not
odd.
wrong. It's odd. It's very odd positioning. And everywhere you look, open access this, private sector that.
It is odd, is definitely the word for it. I could understand it if it would said it produce an annual report on its performance or what it's achieved or anything else. But all that huge emphasis on open access, which is only ever going to be a tiny part of the railway's passenger business in relative terms. I mean, one insider explained it to me that Sunak is now in 1945 bunker mentality with no real information going in or out of the bunker, and that he's far more exercised and obsessed with what his right wing's up to than any sort of policy, and that this is all about throwing red meat to the right wing because they're worried about they're going to go off to reform or something. So
throwing red meat to the blue walls. This is quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed. It's so he doesn't end up marooned, to make a joke.
Oh, very good. Oh, very, very good. But but this is fascinating, though, isn't it? If you sort of take this a bit further and say, well, what was it we really wanted out of the Williams review? Whatever your perspective on the public or the private sector or structure, what we all wanted was a coming together and a strategic set of decisions being taken in a unified body. That's what we all wanted, right? And that, in fairness, does actually seem to be what's being discussed here. But when you dig a bit deeper, there's some interesting nuances, right? So the DFT in their press statement when they launched this thing said, the establishment of GBR will create more accountability, okay, by bringing together the management of the network and the commissioning of passenger services into a new public rail body that puts customers first and delivers efficiency. And you kind of go, okay, that sounds okay. Then they separately say we will see better services by bringing track and train together, enabling the sector to run as one system for the benefit of customers and taxpayers. Now, I think this is slightly confused in the way they've described this, because if this new body that they're creating is actually going to commission the private sector to run passenger services, which is basically a kind of an extension, I suppose it's a different form of franchising, isn't it, really? Then evidentially, track and train have not been brought back together in the way that they kind of want people to believe it has. It's sort of really the status quo, but at least the franchising bit's been brought into the same place as the infrastructure authority.
Because they did say the management of, didn't they? And that would probably be
there. Yeah, they did. I mean, I just think what they've described there implied, particularly given what you've just said about open access, I know what you mean. There's never going to be much of it, but clearly this plans for there being more of it. So that's going to be, more contracts, more interfaces, more things to manage. And I don't know. I just think there's lots of sound bites in this, but some of it don't quite hang together.
On that subject, can you have a quick walk us through of the structure that they're proposing, because I've seen Network Rail described as the IRB. I've seen GBR described as the IRB. And I must admit, I was pretty confused for a while. I'm not sure whether my confusion has been totally eliminated, but...
Oh, right, well, let's have a go, shall we?
Go on, let's...
I can understand why you're a bit confused. It does feel a bit... It is a little bit... I think it's a bit confusing, right? So, and I'm not saying that I'm the fount of knowledge here on this, but this is how I read it, okay? So, one bit of context. So today, to be allowed to run the network... the kind of the operating entity within Network Rail, which is called Network Rail Infrastructure Limited, has a thing called a network license, which is granted by the Secretary of State under, happens to be Section 8 of the Railways Act 1993. Okay, so Network Rail's got the license. Network Rail Infrastructure Limited's got the license. So that's the background. So what this bill will do is it will create what they call an integrated rail body, which I take to mean what we label Great British Railways. I think that is a brand name for what this integrated rail body is. It will be established as the strategic decision-making body for railways in Great Britain. It will be responsible for exercising the functions of a franchising authority, right, and an infrastructure manager, and will be required to fulfill a range of functions and duties through its network license. Okay? And it then goes on to explain it is the government's intention that Network Rail Infrastructure Limited, the Network Rail company that's currently got that license, will be designated as the new integrated rail body, right? And they'll revoke its old license and give it a new one, which is a kind of, I suppose, a bit of window dressing, really. So from a legal point of view, Network Rail Infrastructure Limited will effectively become the integrated rail body, and it will have a license to operate the network as it currently does. It'll just be a new one, and it will carry out the franchising function as well. Some people have said that means Network Rail's in charge, right? Now, Network Rail will be at great pains, and rightly so, to say, hang on. I mean, Andrew Haynes has said this is not Network Rail 2.0 because a lot of this is about culture and it's about changing the way we do things. And he's right. Okay. So there's a slight conflict between the legal reality and what they want to do with it. If that
I want to
makes
comment
sense.
on that in a minute. Can I just ask you something, though? Are you saying that GBR and Network Rail Infrastructure Limited or Network Rail are going to be brought together under one roof, branded GBR? So will the Network Rail brand disappear?
Well, that's a very good question. So I don't know the answer to that. It does, the way I read it, they want the brand Great British Railways, and they are going to create an integrated rail body, which for all intents and purposes does exactly what we've always been led to believe that Great British Railways was going to do. So that's why I take the view they're one and the same thing. So, and Network Rail's license, Network Rail Infrastructure Limited, will be the integrated rail body. So it's a bit confusing, but the way I read it is that GBR will take the bit of Network Rail that is the Infrastructure Limited bit, and it will do the franchising bit and bring it all together as a single integrated rail body. Now, what happens to Network Rail's name? I don't know.
I mean, is it too much of a leap to say that what we're looking at there is almost like a British Rail Board 2, which will take instruction from the government on what kind of railway they want and the amount of budget, and those two organisations, however they're wrapped up and presented, will go away and do it?
Well, that could well be it, and who knows? That's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? Can I throw a? Well, you wanted to comment on the culture bit, didn't you? Because then I want to throw a rock in the pond.
Okay. Interestingly, holding it up to the camera for those of you watching in black and white, only this very morning, an hour or so ago, Network Rail responded to two tweets, one by Phil Haig and one by Stephen I's erstwhile alma mater, the Rail magazine. Phil had tweeted, 2 important bits of today's draft rail reform bill transfers franchising power from Secretary of State to the new IRB, gives Secretary of State sole power to grant a network licence to the IRB. DfT plans to designate network rail infrastructure as the IRB, which is what you said. Rail Magazine tweeted, Network Rail to take over franchising as DfT moves towards creating Great British Railways. Now, your comment there about Network Rail being very sensitive about it is true, because Kevin Groves, the head of media at Network Rail, responded immediately and said, while Andrew Haynes said today, I repeat again what I have said previously. GBR must not and can never be Network Rail 2.0. This is a never-to-be-missed opportunity to build something new and better. So it's not Network Rail taking over at all, says Kev, but creating a new organisation with PACS at heart. So you can see they are very sensitive to the argument developing that Network Rail is taking over, which maybe goes to the question about, does the brand survive? It's all very vague, isn't it?
It is vague, actually, and that's a good point about, does that mean, because the brand, sometimes a brand it creates triggers in people's minds as to what it is.
And the Network Rail brand certainly does.
It does, and it's not all bad.
No,
right?
I didn't say that.
No, absolutely. But there are some things that it's mixed, right? As lots of things are mixed.
It sends the consciousness off in directions which they clearly don't want you to go.
Quite. So maybe this is an opportunity to deal with that. I mean, I think that what Kevin Grove said there and what Andrew Haynes has said is fair enough. It absolutely needs to be different. But also, I mean, from the way I read what the department have said, from a legal point of view, it does look like the license that's Network Rail, that will be the new integrated rail body. So there's a little bit of what it looks like under the surface and how it is presented externally, and particularly, I imagine, how it's presented to the people in these organisations who are going to be taking up this role, which actually leads me nicely to my rock, if you will permit me to throw it.
Absolutely. We're standing by waiting for the splash.
Well, I wouldn't slightly. I might have oversold this now. Actually, it might be more of a plop than a splash. I just wonder whether this is the right thing to be focused on anyway at the moment, right? And it's all very well to talk about structures, and there is nothing wrong with wanting to bring things together and a unified body, and there's definitely nothing wrong with getting the Department of Transport out of franchising, right? But the slight problem is, right now, the performance and day-to-day delivery on the railway is simply not good enough.
Appalling.
And in some place, and that does not mean that great people are doing fantastic stuff every single day, right? And let's be clear about that. But the overall delivery in the mind of the consumer is pretty poor. And if it were me, I think for the first 6-12 months, I'm not sure I would move any deck chairs anywhere. I would focus on that and that alone, because without that, we don't build the kind of confidence back in anybody that the railway is going to start performing better and starting to grow. Now, some will say, unless we make these changes, that'll never happen.
We can't do that. Yeah.
I disagree with that. I think you can. I really think you can get people in a room in a way that delivers a single objective, irrespective of who they work for and what their name badge says. But that's just me. But that,
no, I agree.
So I would focus on that performance reliability stuff.
To put it in
nothing else.
To put it in colloquial terms, the railway's up to its arse in alligators, and now is no time to drain the swamp. Yeah.
All right. Answers on a postcard from listeners, please, on that one, if you think you understand it. No, I know what you mean. And that's fair. That's fair enough. I mean, look, let's just go back to what Andrew Haynes said on the 8th of December.
Oh, yes.
I think it was on the 8th of December.
Too many actors.
Too many actors. He said, too many individual actors seeing risk from their own perspective. So there's a concern that with, yes, we've brought the strategic leadership of franchising and the network license into one place. Okay, it's fine. You've still got all these businesses and concessions and franchises operating. So they're still all going to see risk from their own perspective. And by the way, we've now added another little challenge, which is everybody's thinking, well, what's my job going to be? And how's this reorganization going to work? And that is distracting. So that is the concern. But we wait and see what Labour said. But you were, I don't know whether we want to carry on talking about the rail reform bill, but I know that you watched a thing last night where maybe Labour's views were more clear.
The Bradshaw lecture is always a very important event in the railway calendar. It's usually a weighty speech of strategic importance delivered by an individual to about 200 real high-level or significant people within the industry. And interesting, the networking is as important that night as what you hear from the speaker. But this year is a bit different. It was framed as an election special, so we had Rail Minister Hugh Merriman, and his Labour shadow, Stephen Morgan, effectively doing a 10 minutes each hustings-style address.
Okay.
I watched from home because there were no trains on the East Coast Main Line, and two-hour bus journeys was not exactly appealing to me. But it was good to see it online, and I could scoff loudly and fidget as much as I wanted. But what we got, yawn, was nothing new. Absolutely nothing new. Commend Hugh for the brio and enthusiasm with which he delivered a plan which, as we all suppose, is never going to get delivered. It's not going to get enacted before election, and highly unlikely he'll be there after the election. But he did it with great enthusiasm. Stephen Morgan was a likeable fellow, I thought, from what we saw, but he's only been in the job 6 months. And it was all, oh God, I don't want to be rude, but predictably lightweight and laden with, political and railway cliches about delivering for the passenger and the nationalisation trope because it's what people wanted. So we'd all heard it a lot before. It was chaired by Sky News political correspondent Tamara Cohen. And they always have a national journalist to do these things, and usually it's a bit superficial, but she was really on it. She pressed them very hard and came up with at least one quite good jibe at Grant Shapps, which always goes down well with green signals. But nothing really new. It was, get 200 very sort of significant people together and tell them things which they already know.
Did she manage to land any punches on either? Did she give them any question that they wriggled awkwardly at?
I think she made the both of them feel uncomfortable when Hugh sat down, and she'd clearly done her research, which is really good, and she was very confident. She did a great job. I was really impressed. Hugh sat down, and she immediately sort of mocked Grant Shapps, really, and said it was 3 years since the IRP had been...
Integrated Rail Plan, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, the Disintegrated Rail Plan, as we know like to call it, yeah.
And she said, well, that was by Grant Shapps. And she said, he's been terribly busy since then. She said, he's been, and she delivered it in this sort of quite sing-song, Mickey-taking tone. She said he's been Home Secretary, Business Secretary, Energy Secretary, and now he's Defence Secretary. She said, but rail reform's barely moved. Why?
Excellent.
So Hugh, to his credit, he's a politician. He'll always come up with an answer. Waffled a bit about behind the scenes. GBRTT had been beavering away with the really important stuff, the change management. And he mentioned transferring powers from the Secretary of State to GBR. But we've been working behind the scenes to get change management. The biggest part of the job, he said, done. She pressed him on, is it going to be this side of the election? Hugh tried to sidestep it, and she kept nailing him down. Is it going the election or not? And he said, well, if he got a chance to, then yes, it would. But, and she then followed with the googly by saying, well, your own boss, Mark Harper, says it's unlikely.
Dear, oh dear.
So she was really good with him. And then she also lined up Stephen Morgan for a bit of a drubbing himself when he sat down after his speech. And she said, look, thank you for that, Stephen. She said, Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor, she said she's already put a red line through any chance of public ownership for energy or water. If it's not right for them, why is it right for rail? And we got all the tropes about, people liking it. Well, yes, they do. It's dog whistle politics, isn't it? He agreed with much of the outcome of the Williams review and wanted to build on it, but said public ownership was clearly the answer from their review of the circumstances. And the most ridiculous thing, I think he said, was we can't say after the last 30 years that it's been a successful time. Well,
really? Wow.
Rollicks to that. no, yes, of course, there's been problems, crisis, chaos, and everything else. But which bit of doubling passengers in 20 years can be regarded as anything other than a success?
Well, that would have happened anyway, wouldn't
because
it?
of GDP.
Oh, yeah. No,
yeah,
because
but 2008
GDP.
and 9 proved that wrong, didn't it?
It's an interesting point about the what Rachel Reeves has said about that. Actually, just picking up on that, that's because I suppose the big difference is reality is that the railways now, Network Rail is in public ownership. It's on the PSBR. So all you need to do really is, as the franchises, stroke concessions, whatever you call them, expire, you just bring them back into directly.
What? Into
something. All right, into something. Right, we're not sure yet. But I guess into.
But he says that process will save £1.5 billion. I think that's nonsense. I think there's a real chance it could cost more. But poor man, unwittingly, was guilty of one of the most hysterical slips of the tongue I've heard heard in a long time. And I wrote it down word for word. I recorded the audio on my iPhone, so I know this is right. About 30 minutes into the meeting as a whole, so Hugh had finished and he was up there, and he said, and I quote directly, "Under Labour's plans, everything will be detested. Tested against passenger delivery."
Oh, poor guy. Poor guy.
Urgent major reform is needed, and under Labour, it is coming. Oh, God, yawn, So, Tamara Cohen really gave them both a very uncomfortable moment, which I think surprised them both. I think they thought it was going to be a bit sort of fluffy and all the rest of it. And she was good. Well done, Tamara. If you get to hear this, I was really impressed. There were a succession of questions when they'd both done from railway people, including Steve Montgomery, Steve Murphy, Mary Grant, Darren Kaplan, Dominic Booth. But actually, the most important question of the evening, which led me to shut down the computer with a real this going through my mind, was from Nina Lockwood, who runs the Intuitive Senior Executive Recruitment Company up in Chorley in Lancashire.
God's own country. Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, where Nina lives, it is beautiful. Leeds and Liverpool Canal, the Top Lock pub. Anyway, I waffle. She came up with the most important question of the night. She says, look, I don't know anything about trains, really. She says, but I really care about people. And she said, only 16% of the workforce are women. There's a huge bow wage of approaching retirements coming up. 75% of the workforce is eligible for retirement in the next 5 years. And our failure to either recruit or retain that specialist knowledge means we're going to be screwed without it. She said only 4% of the workforce is 25 or under, and the average age of a driver is 52.
It's quite a remarkable set of stats, and well done, Nina, for highlighting them. I mean, I didn't know some of those. But you say to yourself, was it 4% under 25? And that goes back to our point earlier. If we don't make this an industry in which people actually genuinely want to come and work because it's got an improving external press, then
we're screwed.
Cheapers. Yeah, we got a real
because
problem.
At one end we've got all those retirements. We're bleeding people through the Middle Ages who are just getting fed up with it, and we're not getting young people in at the bottom. So are we going to emerge from this argument about nationalise or privatise and everything else and look round and find we haven't the people to do either?
So overall, you attended the Bradshaw lecture virtually and came away sort of, excited.
I was excited to get downstairs and reach for the bottle, Richard, and
there we go.
Have a couple of glasses of wine. Andy Bagnall, Rail Partners, he came up with, I thought was a memorable sort of quote. He said, as we all know, railways aren't important in elections, but this election is going to be very important for the railway.
That's well done, Andy. That's a good line. I like that.
I like that as well. You can see that on a strap, can't you?
That is a very good line.
And he said, just follow the evidence of what works, and can we please get on with it? And that JFDI aspect is really crucial, isn't it, Richard?
It is.
It really is. But
do you know what? I think we should apply that logic and move swiftly on.
JFDI. Right, it's I'm going to shut up for a bit, which will be a welcome relief for everyone, and hand you over to the calm embrace of Mr. Bowker.
Well, indeed. Thank you, Nigel. Yeah. There's a story that's hit the national news extensively, actually, recently, involving Avanti West Coast and their policies for supporting women going through the menopause. And it hit the headlines sort of this week, I think early this week, because ASLEF had tweeted a picture of a card that detailed the contents of a bag, and within the bag were various items, and this card sort of listed what they were, and it said things like tissue if you're feeling a bit emotional, or paper clip to help you keep it all together. And then there was jelly baby in case you feel like biting someone's head off. And I mean, I saw it and went, okay. ASLEF called the packs an insulting gimmick, and national media sort of jumped all over it and wanted to talk about it and really sort of give Avanti, frankly, a bit of a kicking for being insensitive and not thinking things through properly and all the rest. Of course, when you dig a bit deeper, it's much more complicated than that. Avanti actually had put in place a gender working group it was a volunteer group made up of staff at all levels. And actually, this initiative was spearheaded by two women who'd recently gone through the menopause. It was launched in July last year. So
it's not new?
No, it's about 8 months old. The packs aren't actually handed out. They're available for people if they attend any of these drop-in sessions, which they're all invited to do. There's been a number of menopause initiatives from Avanti West Coast, and actually there was really positive feedback from the drop-in sessions, and there's been no complaints internally, according to Avanti, raised about the packs.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so why did ASLEF just go straight to social media instead of talking to Avanti? We don't know, and actually we've asked if Avanti would like to come on to Green Signals and talk about this, because this is a really important issue, right? A really, really important issue. One thing, though, I did spot on LinkedIn. There's a lady called Amantha King, who is a workplace menopause consultant. And if anybody's got access to LinkedIn, we'll put a link in on the website. Absolutely should read what she has to say, because it's brilliant. And she says, I'm going to read one little bit of it, that's all. She said, firstly, I'd like to say how much I appreciate the work Avanti West Coast have done to date to address and progress menopause issues in their workplace, and the fact that they're one of only 30% of all employers to address this in the UK. So she starts by saying, they need actually support for this, because
they've been doing a good job. Yeah.
They've started to address it. What she then goes on to explain, though, is that something went wrong in the process. Where was the check and balance? Because when you read this card, it's not the way probably it should have been written. So where was the process to do the checks and the balance? And she goes on to talk about it's not enough to be menopause aware. What her exact language is actually quite clever, really. She says what you really need to do is be menopause competent. You've got, as an organization, you've really got to understand this stuff and look at it at every level. So it was really good. Her piece is well worth a read if you're interested in this subject. It's the most sensible, balanced thing that I've read on it. But we'll invite Avanti and maybe sort of just understand what are all these things they're doing, because it sounds like they're making a real effort, and they should be given the opportunity to say that.
And they may feel a bit sort of hurt. It's blown up in the face and they've got a kick in when it's been well-intentioned.
Yeah.
I was listening to what you said about what was written on the card, and then listening to the fact it was spearheaded by two women who'd recently gone through the menopause. Is it possible that card was an attempt to lighten a serious subject with a bit of humour? The jelly baby in case you feel like biting someone's head off. You can see why that might have come up, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, I felt just like."
But you can also see why sometimes with these things, a group needs to say, "Okay, let's just do a little bit of a reality check. How's that going to perceive?"
Somebody in the room needs to put their hand up and say, "Hang on, just like when whoever in the room suggested changing Royal Mail's name to Consignia, or It needs a sensible voice to just call a halt, perhaps. But I hope Avanti do join us, and maybe now is just a time to just remind them and make clear that green signals approach is not to set tripwires or ambushes or looking for a scoop. We're genuinely seeking to understand, and we'll always talk about every subject we discuss here with courtesy and respect and everything else.
Absolutely. Should we go on to the quiz?
Should we do the highlight quiz of each episode, Richard?
Which we've stuck in the middle this time to catch out those who just go straight to the end. I
also say at this point, it's really good, it's really popular, people are entering, we got to have a prize. Where are our mugs?
Right. That's a bit embarrassing, really. So the company in question, a major, well-known international company, had run out of stock of this particular mug because I wanted one that was green on the inside, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah, and so they'd run out of stock, and they promised me that they'll get some more stock back in this week.
Because I do think we ought to offer a mug as a prize for this.
We should.
There's so much engagement.
Especially if you got this one right. So the question was, in 1939, which LMS locomotive, London Midland Scottish Railway, was shipped to the USA to be exhibited at that year's World Fair and tour America's railroads? Now, loads of people answered, right? And quite a few people said it was Coronation Class Pacific 6220, which was called Coronation. It was the first in the class. And sure enough, if you'd been in America, you would have seen a locomotive with that number and that name. But it was not 6220 Coronation. And I'm sure you'll tell us why Coronation couldn't actually go. But it was 6229, I believe. Duchess of Hamilton. Which, because of a problem with Coronation, was sent over and masqueraded for a number of years as an engine that it wasn't. And indeed, in this country, Coronation was masquerading as Duchess of Hamilton. That's right, isn't it, Nigel?
It is, yeah. I think 6220 was just not in great condition, or Duchess of Hamilton was maybe just ex-works and more reliable, and they didn't want to send something out there. But the interesting corollary to that is, of course, war broke out on September 3rd that year, and Duchess of Hamilton and its train, because a train of carriages went over with it, were all stranded in the US.
And didn't come back till the end of the war? Or was it before the end of the war?
Both. The locomotive came back in 1942 because they were desperate for engines for the war effort. Right. But the carriages were indeed stuck in the States for the rest of the war, and they didn't come back until 1945.
Well, the winner, who knew all of that, clearly, was Gordon Dudman.
Hooray to Gordon, who's an old friend.
Gordon. An old friend and a big listener of ours, so congratulations, Gordon. That was brilliant. So the
Career
answer was,
railwayman and signaller on the Bluebell Railway at Horsted Keynes, I understand.
Indeed so. Right. This week's question.
Right.
It's slightly different this week. Who said this? I'm only going to read it once, right? Who said this?
I shall read this only once.
I am never sure of time or place upon a railroad. I can't read, I can't think, I can't sleep. I can only dream. Rattling along in this railway carriage in a state of luxurious confusion, I take it for granted. I am coming from somewhere and going somewhere else. I know nothing about myself. For anything I know, I may be coming from the moon.
I have no idea, but railroad, maybe a bit of a clue. I don't know. Anyway,
usual rules apply. If you think you know, ping us the answer, tag us, email us, put it on YouTube, whichever is your chosen route. First person gets a shout out. And if you can get this one, then you will get a mug when they arrive. Definitely.
Indeed.
And having talked about things that happened many years ago, let's talk about something that's happening right now and looks to the future. So this is our positive story slot. I don't know if you saw this one, Nigel. It has been all over the press. I'm sure you did. Great Western Railway's GWR's FastCharge battery class. Is it class 230?
It is. I'm
not as up onto my numbers as I used to be.
I guess it's a subclass of the 230s because there were DMUs and hybrids, but yes, it's the latest.
All sorts of stuff, wasn't it? It was a former London Underground D-stock carriage that's been converted. Well, last week it travelled a record 86 miles on battery power without recharging, which was a UK record, and then followed a few days later by a 70-mile which involve going down the main line, actually, I think, which the engineers on board say only used about 45% of its battery. And I've seen some footage of it, which if you're watching on YouTube, you can see some pictures of it. And it's absolutely superb. In fact, the engineers said they reckoned it could have done more than 120 miles in that charge. And this is a great trial, right? So whatever your views on electrification or whether we should be hanging out for hydrogen or all those kind of things, I personally tend to think that a rolling program of electrification we should be doing because that's available technology now and it'll never be wasted. But
certainly for the main lines. For
the main line. But for the kind of services they're planning for this, which I think is going to be initially going up the Greenford branch, isn't it, in West London? And they reckon that it'll be able to do the fast charge is key. So the next thing is the trials on the fast charging to enable it to charge when it's doing station turnarounds. And I mean, this could be real game changer stuff. So well done, GWR. Brilliant stuff. And we'll be watching this one because it's exciting.
By way of sort of context, this is the phoenix that rose from the ashes of Adrian Shooter's project to convert the D-stock into trains for the main line, which was not that successful. But Mark Hopwood, all credit at Great Western, they actually bought the battery technology which Viva Rail were developing together with some trains and have produced this. And you're right, it went from Long Marston, where it's being developed and put together, to Reading to start trials on the Greenford branch. And the really interesting thing is you don't have to think too hard, do you, that Great Western could find other applications for it on the Cornish branches.
Everywhere. In every sense, it's a positive story.
Oh, I didn't think you'd go there, but you clearly have.
I know, sorry. Right.
But no, it's a good one. But there is great potential in the right circumstances.
Yeah.
And we really wish it well. I really want to see this succeed.
Yeah.
Right. Moving on. Richard's comments on beeching last week have exercised quite a few of you, not all positively. But lots of people got in touch to give us what they thought. We had 150 likes. Indeed, the vast majority of our comments were supportive. However, listener Will Tucker said this. Bear with me. It's a bit longer. Much as I've very much enjoyed your podcast so far, this one I found depressing. Looking back over the last half century of modern railway developments, I can remember 2000 to 2009 always strikes me as a wasted decade. So much was expected of the Labour government. John Prescott had even talked about renationalisation until he came to power, but it feels so little delivered. I'd always wondered why. Listening to Richard emphasising the cost of everything with his economist's perspective, that's hard to say, I now understand why. He goes on, do nothing option 1 and let's procrastinate forever option 2 are simply not appropriate for, as an example, tackling commuting headaches in Manchester and Leeds. Richard is entitled to his views, of course. Read the subtext there. Thankfully, the Borders line reopening is an example of where better sense prevailed. Richard, you've properly touched a nerve there, and not for the first time. The floor is yours.
Well, I think we can probably have hopefully a bit of a kind of a back and forth on this one, Nigel, because you've got strong opinions as well, and sometimes they align. They're aligned, and sometimes they're not. Look, I've never said we should procrastinate forever. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I'm actually in danger of often being the opposite, really. And I'm a huge believer in.
Steph and I have discovered that.
Well, just get it done.
Exactly.
And I get quite agitated when things don't just get done. Ask my family, drive them mad. So that I don't quite agree. Well, I certainly don't agree with procrastinating, but I do agree with. Thinking these three things through and not just saying, and I know Will, who made that comment, didn't say what I'm about to say, but quite a lot of others did. I just don't believe in the, just build it and they'll come thing.
Field of dreams stuff, yeah.
Yeah, because that, and there's a number of reasons why I don't believe that. You do need to think about what your core priorities are. Capital is not infinite. it's a limited thing. When government looks at all the tax revenue that it's got coming in and looks at its expenditure obligations, the difference is borrowing. And at the moment, borrowing is quite expensive for a variety of reasons. I mean, not least thanks to this government, actually, and Liz Truss and all that. But that's another conversation. But nonetheless, capital is not infinite. So you can't do everything you want to do. And you do run the risk of something called crowding out. And that is, I suppose, that is a concern. If you spend it on A, you might not be able to spend it on B, and B might be better. You've crowded out that ability, right? And that's where the concern comes from. So I don't really change anything I said. I just believe that sometimes with a lot of these beaching schemes, people are, it just makes sense, just build it and the people will come. And just because a lot of people come doesn't mean it was the right thing to do.
That's right. There were also some comments from, I can't remember his surname now, Gary, the chap in Perth, used to be a driver and he was a fireman watch commander, but he tweeted that he'd discovered green signals on a road trip and absolutely loved it. And he said, instinctively, Nigel, I wanted to see beaching roll back, but I was really taken with Richard's comments as to why it can't be done. So, extending that debate, not everybody hated you for it, Richard.
Well, can't be done everywhere. Some, I think, should be done, right? So let's just talk a bit about that Borders Railway thing, because Will in his piece said, thank goodness common sense prevailed and it got built. Okay, so let's try a little game. You up for a bit of a game?
Absolutely.
No. I mean, this is just a silly example to hopefully try and demonstrate what I mean. Let's just say that the Borders Railway had cost £350 million, which is actually what it did do. Well, let's actually pick a different number, right? Let's say £500 million, and only one person a week used it. Would that be a good use of money? Well, clearly it wouldn't, right? If you've spent all of that money and one person...
Sorry, I thought it was rhetorical.
Oh, I say, right, okay. No, I said we're going to play a game. All right, okay, fair enough. I'll play a game with myself, right? So it's it's cost us £500 million and one person's using it. That clearly is madness, right? It's also a stupid example. I've deliberately chosen an extreme position. Let's take the other extreme position. It cost us £1, right? And 5 million people a year are using it. Well, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it? I mean, let's build everything if that's the number. So we've got one extreme where it's mad to do it and another extreme where it's mad not to do it. Now, you tell me the Borders Railway costs £350 million CapEx, right? That doesn't include the operating costs as a CapEx. And I think about 1.5 million, 2 million people a year are using it, something of that order of magnitude. Is that, which end of that spectrum I said, does the actual example sit? Where is it? Is it in the it made sense or it didn't make sense?
Well, it's somewhere in the middle, isn't it?
It's somewhere in the middle. And the answer is we don't really know, right? Now, when Bill Reeve was on this show, he said, if we use a traditional method of evaluation, you wouldn't do it. But if you use the method that the Scottish Government now want, because they're looking at different objectives, you would do it. And I said then, and I'd say it again now, that's fine, right? As long as you've got criteria and you can say,
and
I know why I'm doing
an
this.
Informed decision.
And you make an informed decision, it's fine. But that doesn't mean that's not the same. And actually, Bill agreed, just do it. It makes sense. That's not what you do.
No, I don't think anybody with any common sense about them would ever suggest that. But they've got to be done as part of an overall strategy, haven't they? Yeah. I mean, the Borders was done, as Bill tells us, as a tool for economic development in the Borders region, whereas Oakhampton was to extend the railway's reach beyond Oakhampton with all those buses and things. So there was a joint strategic plan which was implemented very carefully and seems to be working because the railway's reach has been extended way beyond Oakhampton by those bus services, which has got to be a good thing, hasn't it?
It is a good thing, right? And actually your point about a joined-up strategy is really key. So a lot of people very concerned when we had the freight discussion about container ports and London Gateway and Felixstowe and getting stuff up to the north of England, things like that, right? I don't know if you know too much about this project, but there's a thing called the Lower Thames Crossing.
I do.
Which is a project. It's the biggest road scheme of all, right? And it's basically the Dartford Bridge relief road. So what it will enable trucks coming up the M2, I guess, from Dover and Folkestone, instead of coming up to the M25 and having to go over the bridge, they'll be able to turn right before they get to it, go under the river, and then join the M25 further up. Right? That's the kind of the plan. I think it's something in the order of, I want to say, 9 billion, 10 billion pounds, and that is a couple of years ago. So we've had more construction price inflation.
For a relatively short piece of road.
Relatively short piece of road, which already the modelling, I believe, says it's going to just fill up pretty much straight away. I know Thurrock Council have said it's going to take about 14% of our green belt. So it has massive environmental implications. Hang on a minute. Is somebody in the roads department saying, well, should we do that, or should we actually put a load more capacity to get more container freight out of these ports up to the north of England by rail? So this whole strategy question starts to get really interesting.
And double standards. During the muck and bullets of the HS2 phase, when the parliamentary votes weren't in place and the Act wasn't done and it was really kicking off on Twitter, I had some graphics somewhere which illustrated the extent of damage to trees compared with HS2, and it's excessively huge compared with HS2.
On the Lower Thames crossing.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
It was marginal consumption of ancient woodlands, whereas the Lower Thames crossing consumed acres and acres and acres and acres of trees, and yet there was never a complaint about this, whereas, a privet was damaged somewhere on HS2 and the eco warriors were all out complaining about it. Roads seem to get a free pass on this.
Which I suppose in some of the comments about what I said about beaching, a lot of people made that very point, said it's kind of double standards. And we seem to appraise rail reopenings in a much more strict way than the roads seem to get away with. And, there may be some truth in that. I don't know. I mean, look, back on maybe we should come back and at some point have a really good discussion about this whole strategy question, because I think this road versus rail thing is going up a level is actually really interesting. But on the beaching thing, I promise I didn't say they never make any sense, right? I really didn't say that. But equally, I did say you can't just go, just build it. It'll be fine. It's strategic. It's the right thing to do. You just need to get more people on the train. That is not a good way,
I guess,
spending taxpayers' money.
I guess the fact that the reopenings that we've done have done so well imply that the processes were quite good and the right decisions were made. Because there's never been a reopening where it didn't work.
I go back to my earlier comment. Just because certain trains are full at certain times of the day does not automatically of itself mean that you made the right decision in terms of allocating that amount of capital. But I can already hear people going, told you, he's just a flipping economist, and all he wants to do, he knows the price, he knows the cost of everything and the value of nout.
And even when you prove to him that the trains are full, that's still not good enough.
Yeah, I think I might have to retire gracefully. So, and by the way, nothing changes the fact that the reversing beeching proposals of 4 or 5 years ago were a bit of a grandstanding exercise. They weren't actually a real attempt at
distraction for the national media who completely lose the plot when they hear beaching. I mean, Oakhampton was a 1971 closure, wasn't it? So not beaching. And the restitution of the Ashington line in the northeast was happening anyway, and has much more to do with the massive energy and nexus as Tobin Hughes than it ever had to do with Grant Shapps or anyone else at Great Minster House, the Borg Cube, as you referred to it the other day.
Oh, yeah. Resistance is futile.
Indeed so.
Anyway, there we go.
There we are. Well, actually, there we go again. That's all we've got time for this week. Yet again, over too soon, as all the best things in life are. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying with us, and we hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back next week with another cornucopia of railway discussion. Good word, that's the one for the episode. But until then, from me and from Richard, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.